We're going to do a little bit more work from the book, and in this case we're going to get our feet wet translating English into our symbolic language. It's not as easy as these examples. There are a lot of things that we have to watch out for and learn about. I want to alert you to these uppercase letters below each of the arguments. Yes, this is on page 383. This is called our key, our translation key. We're to use those uppercase letters to translate the simple statements that the argument contains. Now, not all of the exercises in this book have those uppercase letters. That's unfortunate. Not only will you have the uppercase letters in that key on your test, but I also write out in the key exactly what simple statement, for example, H represents. Okay, that's real helpful. Another thing, the order in which these letters appear in the key, that's the order in which the simple statements will be in your translation, but not necessarily in the argument. For example, there are probably 10 to 12 ways of making a conditional statement in English. Whenever we encounter one of those examples, I'll point it out to you. But one way we have of making a conditional statement in English is by saying the consequent first. Okay, so just using the letters P and Q, typically we would write if P, then Q. But we could write Q if P. Okay, Q is still the consequent. P is the antecedent. The antecedent is associated with the if part of the statement. The consequent is associated with then. Then doesn't even have to be there. We could say if P, comma, Q. But back to my original example. Q if P. Since that would be translated P horseshoe Q, P would be the first letter here. But it wouldn't be the first simple statement in the argument. Do you understand what I'm explaining? The argument might say Q if P, right? That would have to be translated P horseshoe Q. And I'm saying P would come first in the key, because that's the first letter you'll use in your translation. It might not be the first simple statement that occurs in the English language argument. Secondly, let's say H and P are the first simple statements that occur in our argument. H may be repeated before S occurs. P may be repeated before S occurs. And so on and so forth. And then I think the last thing I'll point out to you before we start this or try this is that there are many ways to make a negation in the English language. We're just learning it as not P. You probably almost never find that in the English language. So we have to be alert for all the different sorts of ways to make a negation. Secondly, there's some controversy in logic about exactly what counts as a negated statement, in English, and therefore to be translated with a curl. So here's what we do. These uppercase letters all refer to affirmative statements. Affirmative statements. Okay? Now, there's no reason to apply a curl unless, in reading through the argument, you find the affirmative statement somehow negated later. Then that later negation would get the curl. If you think you come to a statement that sounds in English like it's a negation, there's no need to apply a curl unless you find that statement clearly affirmed elsewhere. Then you go back and supply the curl. Let's see how we do in a couple of these. Two more things. Each complete English sentence, and that would have the ending punctuation of a period, okay? That has to be translated as an entire premise or the entire conclusion. In other words, you can't break up an English sentence into two premises, or a premise and a conclusion. It's not going to happen. Okay? And the second thing is that in all these exercises, fortunately, and this will be this way in your test as well, the author is putting the conclusion last in every case. So we don't have to worry about finding the conclusion. It's going to come last. Okay, let's try our hand at number 2. Until you get good at this, and some of you will be good tonight, I'm going to go through sort of a tedious process that has, I think, 3 different layers or levels of translation. And I suggest you do this until you're confident that you don't need to do it. If we look at this first sentence here in number, let's see, what do we want to look at? Is that 1 right there? Okay. The first sentence in 1 is from if all the way to this period right here. So that's going to be an entire premise of translation. In my first level of translation, the only thing I want to do is substitute the uppercase letters for the simple statements. And I'm going to retain all the other English words and the English punctuation like commas or semicolons. So let me show you my first level of translation of that first sentence. H for you study the humanities. P for you will develop an understanding of people. S, notice how they're occurring in the same order that they are here in the P. S for you study the sciences. You will develop an understanding of the world about you. That's W. So look what I've done here. The only thing I've changed about that English language sentence is I plugged in the uppercase letters for the simple statements. I've kept everything else. If, comma, kept the commas. Sometimes those commas are critical in determining where to put our logical punctuation, like parentheses or brackets or braces. Sometimes not. Sometimes they are. And I've kept everything else. And, if, that comma, then. Okay, in my next level of translation, I'm going to replace words that are spoken specifically when one of our symbols occurs with those symbols. For example, when we're reading a conditional statement, we say the word then when we get to the horseshoe, right? When we read a conjunction, we say the word and when we get to the dot. So I'm going to replace and with a dot, and there's another then. So I'm going to rewrite that entire translation right there, but this time I'm going to substitute those symbols for those words.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I'm sorry. What part of the sentence did the W represent? I just lost that part. I missed that part.
The world.
You will develop an understanding of the world about you. There's my second level of translation, so to speak. And now below that, I'm simply going to write our symbols. I'm going to leave everything else behind up here in this level of translation. This is a meaningless statement. There's no indication of what kind of a compound statement it is. A conditional statement defined by the first horseshoe, a conjunction defined by that dot, or a conditional statement defined by that second horseshoe. There are at least 3 ways to punctuate this, maybe more. Okay? So how do you know what to do? Well, one thing I'll tell you right now is that this resembles a real common compound statement that's used in reasoning. A conjunction of 2 horseshoes. Okay? So you might try, and by the way, that is the correct punctuation. You might try out what you suspect is the case. There are often more clues in other situations. Now, if we've got those parentheses in the right place, then when you read this symbolic statement, it should, it's like 99 times out of 100, it should read the same way our first level of translation reads. So I'm going to read this symbolic statement, and if you like, you could read along up here. I think in this case it is going to be exactly the same. So this is read, if H, then P, and if S, then W, and is that what our first level of translation reads? Okay, let's change that punctuation a little bit and see if it might make a difference. That is a possible punctuation of this symbolic statement. However, when we read this, it will not read the same way our first level of translation does. So I'll read this, and if you like, you can look along up here. This is read if, both, if, and it's wrong already, because that's not what the English reads. Okay, so our first premise is translated. So, then in number 1, I think it gets right to the conclusion. I mean, it's one premise and a conclusion. We have a conclusion indicator there, so, and let's go ahead and try this admittedly tedious layered translation procedure. Aha. Well, here we have our first sort of odd situation here. This is a matter of style. The author of this argument has decided to break up the first simple statement, you study the humanities, with the word either. The word either could have been spoken before you. It's a matter of style. But we know there's a disjunction coming up. There's our word or. Now look at what comes after or. The sciences. That's not an independent clause. Is that a simple statement in our argument? Yeah, it is. This again is a matter of style. You have to understand the complete simple statement with information that occurs previously in the sentence. So what are those two words, the sciences? What simple statement are they representing? That's right. You study the sciences, right? Okay. Then we have another horseshoe, looks like. Again, the word either. It occurs smack in the middle, or in progress of that simple statement. It could have been put before the word you. Do you understand what I'm pointing out? And look again. After the word or, there's going to be a wedge there. We have another incomplete simple statement. Of the world about you. Well, what simple statement does that represent? You have to complete it or understand its completion with information that occurs at the beginning of the sentence. So what is our simple statement? You will develop an understanding of the world about you. Right? You understand what I'm pointing out? Okay, let's see how you translate that. Do the multi-layered thing if you want. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm moving my word either. Oops. There's my first level of translation. Necessary? No, it's not necessary. I would recommend it until you pick it up. Okay, next layer. I'm going to replace words with symbols. Words that are spoken when specific symbols occur in our symbolic language. Nothing there, nothing there, nothing. Okay, that or is going to be replaced by the wedge. The word then is going to be replaced by a horseshoe. The word or is going to be replaced by a wedge. I'm going to leave everything else. And that's my second layer right there. Last, just the symbols. Like so. Okay, now, in this case, that comma is meaningful. That comma is suggesting a punctuation for the first part of this symbolic statement. And what it's suggesting is that H wedge S must be punctuated separately before the horseshoe. Do you understand it that way? Or could you understand it that way? That comma is indicating that none of those symbols are to be punctuated along with or including the horseshoe or anything that comes after it. Once you put the parentheses around those, then there's only one way to finish off the punctuation. So this is what the comma is suggesting. Oh, actually, there are two ways remaining. However, see, the only two ways remaining are this. Right, that's one. That's one. But only one of them is correct. And in this case, if you read both of them, I think you'll find that one of them does correspond to our first layer of translation, but not the other one. Let's try the wrong one first. If we read this symbolic statement, the first word out of our mouth is either, because we begin reading this way. It would be either, if, either. And that's not what the English reads. If we were to read this correct punctuation, the first word would be if, followed by either. And I think that's the way it's going down. If, either, H or S, then, either, P or W. And that's what our first layer of translation looks like right there. Good? You ready to try your hand at number 2? Let's see if there's anything I need to point out to you about number 2. Any of this. Let's see. No problem with that first sentence. Ah. That's going to simplify some of our punctuation. We know what that means, don't we? What's coming up is a dot within punctuation, right? Ah, look at this. Did somebody say something about this already, I think? What?
There's no then.
There's no then, but that's where it goes. If, comma, you will, all right, you don't have to say the word then in English when you make a conditional statement. I'm telling you, there's probably 10 to 12 ways in English to make a conditional statement. Most of them are covered in the book, and yeah, you got to be aware of them. Reading the wrong one. You have something to check yet? Are you done? Spoiler alert. Are you done? Anybody concur? Yeah, that's what you have. If both H and S, then both P and W. I think that would, except for that word then is not there. But if you supplied that, it would read just like the English or the first level of translation. Good? see. Two simple statements, G and H. I think they want G for Socrates was a great philosopher. There's our premise. It's done. G. That's it. Here's our conclusion. Socrates was happily married. Well, I guess they want us to use H for that. I want to know what you're going to do with this. So go ahead. Translate that. I think he was not happily married. So the stories go. He sent his wife away from his death chamber because she was crying. Didn't want anybody around crying. He had to kill himself.
His soul was immortal, or so he believed, so he wasn't worried.
He killed himself?
Well, that was in ancient Greece. If you were sentenced to death, you had to drink the poison yourself. That's pretty cool, huh? At one time, his wife Xanthippe hid his toga so he couldn't go out philosophizing. What do you think he did?
Went out anyway?
He went out naked. That's what the story says. Okay, do you have that translated? How about that? Do you have that? Okay, you had to do two things here. You had to complete the simple statement that's referred to by the words, he wasn't. That's just English reading comprehension. Either Socrates was happily married or he wasn't happily married. But the second thing you have to do is see that that simple statement, once you complete it, is the negation of this. So either H or not H. And then I think we'll conclude this exercise with the last one and do something different.
Number 3 was really weird. I mean, if we have time.
It's really what?
I thought that the second sentence was confusing of number 3. If you have free will, then if your actions are not determined by any antecedent events, then your actions cannot be predicted.
Yeah.
I guess the comma, the second part of the statement, the second then seems confusing, but it makes sense.
The commas are not always meaningful or helpful. So if you have a comma, like right after the antecedent of a horseshoe, that can't mean anything. And I would say there are no curls involved in that translation. There's no need to apply a curl. So if you look at, see, some people might say, oh, your actions are not determined by any antecedent events. Shouldn't that be a curl?
Yeah, I had to add
No,
that.
not unless somewhere else it says your actions are determined by antecedent events. Then you go back and put a curl there. There's no reason to put a curl there. Okay, number 5. It is. Yes. Oh, wait. Give people a chance to catch up. Oops, I blew it already. Okay, that comma there is meaningful.
So,
Are you ready to have a look?
so
Good. Okay, this exercise is on page 308 and 309. I just want to point out some things to you and recommend that you do them, especially if they're on the E-logic, because all the answers should be there. But these are just single sentences. They're not parts of arguments or anything like that. What this exercise is for is to make you aware of the different ways we have in English of making, for example, a conditional statement. Or there are a few ways to make a disjunction. Oh, there's probably a dozen ways to make a conjunction. Yeah, lots. So this will alert you to some of them. For example, 17, look at number 17. You might not be able to pick out any word that corresponds to a symbol, but it's obviously a compound statement. These all are compound statements. Okay, when your author introduces the wedge, he tells you in the book that in English we can make a disjunction with the word or the word unless. So, although we'll always say either P or Q, in English it could be P unless Q. So unless functions the same way as the word or does. Number 12. You might have some sense that that's a conditional statement, because there's the word if there. But it comes in the middle or between the two simple statements, and there's no then. This is simply, a conditional statement whose consequent is spoken first. Yeah, you're allowed to do that. So if we're using B for Brazil will protest to the UN, and we're using A for Argentina mobilizes, our translation is A horseshoe B. Because A is the antecedent. I don't care where it occurs in the statement. It's with the if part of the relationship. So do you understand what I'm pointing out? That translation is A horseshoe B. Only if. The author points this out in the textbook when he introduces the conditional statement. Only if refers to the consequent of a horseshoe. It's not if, it's different. If introduces the antecedent. Only if introduces a consequent. So number 12 or number 13 would be translated B horseshoe A. I'll explain that only if in a moment. I want to find two more examples here. I can get them on here. Is 21 and 22 on there?
Mm-hmm.
Sufficient condition. Well, this is obviously a compound statement because it has two component simple statements. The question is, what is it? Is this a conjunction, a disjunction, a conditional, a biconditional?